Yeah. So I think after 2 years of COVID and, nearly a million people dead in the US due to any just a lack of a state response on the part of the US government, just deaths that could have been entirely prevented. And then us seeing what's going on in China, and they have like a centralized state response. They don't have the major loss of life that we do here. We people see that, and they kind of see how transparent this anti-China escalation and narrative really is. And I feel the case of Peng Shuai, that sort of speaks to this. It sort of speaks to, like, if all else fails, you want to appeal to liberal feminism's impulse to rescue non-white women from their country's backward beliefs and conditions. And I think this is like the card that they always pull. I saw an article in the New York Times recently, and the title was "Who is the Real China, Eileen Gu or the Chained Woman?" And this is talking about the Olympic athlete, and then this woman who she was in this video that I guess went viral on Douyin, and she was like in a village. And she was like chained. She had like a chain around her neck, and she was like chained. And I don't really know. I don't really understand like the circumstances around it, but it went viral in China, and it sparked a lot of controversy. And this article says the women's starkly different circumstances, celebrated versus silenced, reflect that to the Chinese state, everyone is a tool that serves a purpose until it does not. And again, this speaks to the kind of Orientalism you were talking about earlier, in how everyone in China is a passive victim, and they cannot speak for themselves. And they are just waiting for some kind of Western intervention to liberate them from their own country's like backward beliefs and their own country's like backwardness altogether.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, I'm sure we'll get more into the specifics of Eileen Gu later. I will say, having, or, as I was writing this article, as I said, all I could draw upon was the coverage leading into the Olympics, right?
Mm-hmm.
And certainly one major aspect of the media coverage during the Olympics that I didn't necessarily anticipate, taking as central position as it's turned out to be, has been the position of the diaspora, right? Which, of course, we both find ourselves in, certainly all of us in Qiao Collective. That's the position that we expressly write from. But, Eileen Gu, of course, along with a number of other athletes, right, competing for, either the United States or China, are sort of right at the focus of this. And, there's really sort of like no one in their sights more than Eileen Gu, right? And it's very emblematic of the overall coverage that she is being sort of exceptionalized, along all of these different dimensions, right? One, for having chosen to compete for China in the first place, right? I think that there was a headline that I saw from the Federalist, or another of these like right-wing rags.
I think I know what you're talking about.
I'm paraphrasing here, but it says something in effect of like, in a world of traitorous Eileen Gu's, be a patriotic Nathan Chen, right? So immediately they're drawing a distinction among the athletes, but then, you have this like New York Times op-ed, which you just mentioned, which, even more tendentiously is, taking the obvious fact that, not all of us can be like simultaneously Olympic gold medalists and like academic superstars and supermodels, etc. Like, at age 18, you know, and yeah, literally trying to counterpose it, as though those are sort of like two poles of this like, dichotomous like essence of like Chinese womanhood, right? Opposite, like this really like horrific case that has, been quite openly like a national scandal in China for the several weeks since it originally broke. Certainly not, I think, a story that the government has taken many efforts to tamp down its entirety, because it has gone viral, as you mentioned, right? There's a huge amount of open discussion over it. It's been condemned from all quarters, but yeah, like the overall, sort of exotifying and Orientalist approach, I think is perfectly encapsulated by that example, where, like you have this one example that is the epitome of the like horrifically oppressed, passive victim in need of some kind of external salvation, presumably in the white man's burden style. And the other, you have Eileen Gu, who presents this conundrum. Again, we can get more into it later, right? For the entire like foundational self-image of the West, as like sort of self-evidently, the apex of human development, right? Of human freedom, of advancement along all these dimensions that, if given the choice, like anyone would sort of willingly ally themselves with, right? And serve, in opposition to, a China that is coded as sort of inherently and irreparably like backwards, authoritarian, closed, name your favorite Orientalist trope, right?
Yeah. And a lot of the coverage has been very Orientalist in nature. But what I've noticed is that, while Orientalism treats the East as backward, primitive, fixed, and unchanging, what we've been seeing with this 2 years of COVID coverage, and now with the Olympics coverage, is a kind of techno-Orientalism, which is kind of the opposite, in that the East is too advanced, too technologically superior, too robotic. Like, it's technologically advanced to the point where people's humanity and individuality, which is the thing that Westerners recognize that makes us human, like, it's no longer recognized in China. And this is why I think journalists constantly invoke the specter of the Chinese worker in the hazmat suit, like in COVID coverage, but also there was a lot of talk about, like Chinese workers in hotels, like making drinks behind the bar, wearing a hazmat suit, and then like usually a K95 mask, and then a plastic shield over their face on top of that, right? Because in that kind of getup, in those suits, people become unrecognizable and they look like robots or automatons or something like that. And for a lot of Westerners, it stokes a particular fear about how the communal in Eastern societies is prioritized to this extreme, such that all individuality and humanity are lost and we're no longer even human. So the East is seen as technologically advanced, but culturally backward. And the people, as a result, are emotionless and unfeeling. And so like Orientalism emerged out of a time when the West was dominant and its purpose was to solidify existing colonial relations. But techno-Orientalism kind of comes out of a time when Western hegemony is declining and its purpose is to incite fear of a rising East. But like Orientalism, techno-Orientalism still suggests something dangerous about the East that could threaten Western civilization if left unchecked. And its primary function is still to produce a fear of the Orient, right? I mean, how many times did we see Western coverage of the games described as like dystopian, right? Is that something that you noticed too?
Yeah, well, I think we're all thinking first and foremost of one specific tweet, right? By
Yes, yes.
I believe her name is Mari Saito.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, where she used precisely that language. You know, she said specifically that she got dystopian vibes from, you know, being served cocktails by, you know, a bartender in full PPE for her and other attendees' own protection. Right. That's the thing that gets me about that
Mm-hmm.
particular image is that you know, the entire reason why the games have to take place in this like you know, this closed loop as it's called, you know, that like, you know, the organizers are trying to best to keep like hermetically sealed from you know, the rest of you know, Beijing and the surrounding areas, you know, is because of China's insistence on its successful zero COVID strategy, and the fact that it has needed to maintain this for these past 2 years because you know, the rest of the world and first and foremost the white West, right, Europe and North America with the United States as the emblematic example, you know, approaching as it is 1 million deaths from COVID now, right? Their utter failure to learn any lessons from the, you know, the 2 to 3 months of lead time that they had, right, to learn from China's successful response, to adopt the necessary measures that would have allowed for, you know, a disruptive but ultimately short and decisive, you know, like lockdown that you know, could have just nipped COVID in the bud, as happened, for example, with SARS, right, where the initial, you know, state response in that case back in 2003 was far less transparent and effectual, but you know, nonetheless, like, it's a disease that you know, has been eradicated, right? And in the case of COVID, like, you know, the entire reason why we've had every you know, like new dominant strain that has, you know, emerged and, you know, spread across the world since the original one, you know, has been this combination of complete, you know, incapacity and refusal to take these necessary measures in the West, right? Plus the, you know, regime of vaccine apartheid, in which they have like arrogated to themselves as enormously lucrative intellectual property for large pharmaceutical companies. You know, the tool that, if equitably distributed, you know, could have in fact induced herd immunity on a worldwide scale by this point, and thereby, you know, rendered COVID, if not it's extinct, then genuinely manageable, right? Like, people out in the West now are talking about living with COVID, but you know, what they're talking about is accepting as a new normal baseline reality, you know, the expectation that with every, you know, combined cold, flu, COVID, you know, winter season, you'll have, you know, healthcare systems strained, you know, to breaking point. You will have thousands of deaths a day, as we just saw recently with Omicron, and you know, and we're still on the tail end of that. But yeah, like this now is the world, right? That the West predominantly has made, and which, you know, China, like, very justifiably, you know, is still putting in place all requisite measures to prevent from becoming their reality, you know. And
Mhm.
you know, it's very interesting to me. Like a lot of these, again, like overwhelmingly sort of diaspora, you know, like Asian or Chinese diaspora journalists, right, coming from the West to cover the games, complaining about like the zero COVID measures would, I think, in a U.S. or other Western context, be like yeah, extremely you know dead set against sort of anti-vax, anti-mask, and otherwise, you know, uh, yeah, like attitudes that um, have contributed right to the persistence of the pandemic this entire time, at least on an individual level. But then they see, an institutional and a state response that addresses that from all angles, right? Not just in a top down fashion, but also as we saw originally during the first outbreak in Wuhan and since, right? Like a whole sort of infrastructure of mutual aid at the grassroots level, which has allowed people to survive these like intense but limited lockdowns. They see that and they cannot interpret it as anything other than like this yeah, like totalitarian, like all seeing techno-Orientalist, like panopticon of surveillance, right? And yeah, that infuses like all elements of their coverage, particularly regarding the anti-COVID measures that have been taken inside the
Mhm.
Beijing closed loop.
Yeah, for me, reading all of this coverage, what's been really fascinating is the way that they try to depict any and everything as dystopian. Like things that are, well, I mean, like things like digital currency, these disinfectant robots that were common at the hotels where the reporters were staying, people wearing hazmat suits, just basic COVID measures, but things that are even commonplace or like relatively banal or like things that we experience in the US, but we don't really think twice about, right? In this Financial Times article I read, I'm going to pull out a quote. This reporter was talking about, again, this dystopian landscape that he was subjected to while covering the Olympics. He says, Tokyo also introduced a bubble for the Summer Olympics last year, but it was porous and guests could walk around.
Mm-hmm.
Beijing's bubble is on a different level and has a slight doomsday theme. Hotel rooms usually provide guests with one complimentary bottle of water. My room provided 24 liters. As I stepped out on the first morning, an employee in a hazmat suit was heavily dousing the corridor carpets with disinfectant. The hotel restaurant serves food with disposable plates and cutlery. Masks are not only obligatory, they must be a certain kind: N95, KN95, or FFP2. Many staff supplement them with a visor. So, to the list of things that reporters find dystopian, we now have, a lot of bottled water, basic COVID measures like disinfecting carpets and cleaning carpets, paper plates and cutlery, and, protective masks. And then, of course, because the Olympics were taking place in China, a huge deal was made about Chinese surveillance. And there was a lot of coverage about, the great lengths that a lot of athletes were going to avoid having their data stolen or being spied on by the Chinese state. And there was this Yahoo article that talks about this. And, there's a quote in it that says, it's a version what sinologist Perry Link once termed the anaconda in the chandelier. It's a metaphor used to describe how the Chinese government controls dissent and speech, explained Neil Thomas, a China analyst at the Eurasia Group. It basically sits there as a huge anaconda in the chandelier of a room. It doesn't need to do anything, this anaconda. It just needs to be there. It doesn't need to bite you. It doesn't need to spit venom at you, but your behavior will change simply because you know that it exists. Most people, Potter said, will try to escape by keeping a low profile. That is the deliberate intention of the surveillance state. So they just basically took like the idea of the panopticon and made it like 100 times more racist. But what's like really remarkable to me is the way that Americans just have the memory of a goldfish, right? Because how can we even begin to talk about like Chinese surveillance or hyper surveillance in another country when, the Edward Snowden leaks demonstrated that the US government does exactly the same thing to its own citizens, right? Like the NSA would collect phone records of everyone, and they direct like companies like Verizon to hand over all its telephone data to them on an ongoing daily basis. They would directly tap into the servers of like different internet firms like Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo to like track online communication. Like they would surveil US embassies, like even the ones that were allies to the US, like France, South Korea, and Japan. And they would collect and store almost 200 million text messages per day, like across the globe of US citizens. And just a few days after this Yahoo article came out, it was reported by the ACLU, I think, that newly declassified documents revealed that the CIA had been secretly conducting massive surveillance programs that could capture Americans' private information, done without any sort of court approval whatsoever. So all of this is just, all of this is like currently being done to its own citizens in the US. And I was also reading like all of these, there are an incredible number of articles about the fake snow like that's used in the Winter Games. And it's like a huge ordeal is made out of it. And it's like the stories are always framed as this kind of triumph of man over nature, but at what cost, right? And then they go into great detail about how many gallons of water were used to create this fake snow, how much energy the snow machines consumed. But what they often don't tell you is that, it's like China, they say China is the first, it's the first Olympic Games that relies 100% on fake snow. But the 2018 games, they like used 90% fake snow, and 2014 Winter Games, they used like 80% fake snow. So to go from 80 to 90 to 100%, like really isn't that big of a deal. But they use this fake snow story to talk about climate change, right? Because due to climate change, the Winter Games will like rely more and more on this fake snow. And people love to talk about China in the context of climate change because it has a population of 1.4 billion people, and it's now the number one emitter of carbon emissions today, even though the US is the biggest emitter of CO2 over time. So cumulatively, the US has emitted almost twice as much CO2 as China since 1850, and no country in the world has emitted more greenhouse emissions than the US, and the average American is responsible for more emissions than the average Chinese person. So it's I don't know, it's just incredible the things that they like sort of depict as dystopian when it's very commonplace, or they're things that we experience here, but like people don't talk about them for some reason.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you put it really well. I don't have too much to add, other than on the surveillance point, like what they never tell you, except when they do in the odd sort of you know like piece that's quietly rolled out in Technology Review or Bloomberg or whatever, is that China in fact has significantly more robust data privacy laws than the United States. They're probably on par with the EU. In fact, in some respects, possibly even stronger. Certainly not like abnormal by international standards. And in fact, like uh, as part of the train of stories in the last year or so about various like tech firms trying to reduce their involvement or exposure in the Chinese market, or like pulling out of China or Hong Kong. What they've often alighted is is that it's because of these data privacy regulations, which are in fact too stringent for those companies, that they're doing so. Right. The most recent example of this is Grinder, which in fact like was pulled from app stores in China precisely for the reason that it was unwilling to comply with baseline regulations surrounding data privacy in China. And of course, this story was spun from Western angle as part of this narrative, now about what is supposedly like a more recent like large scale crackdown on sort of all expressions or acknowledgments of LGBTQ life in China, right? And without necessarily ignoring the persistence of sort of traditional attitudes surrounding gender and sexuality in China and the ways in which these do impinge on state policy. What happened in this particular case with Grindr is nothing of the sort. Like there still is like like an LGBTQ dating app, Blued, right, which has in fact an even larger user base, is in compliance with Chinese data privacy law, and is entirely unaffected. And with regard to the fake snow, again, I don't have too much to add other than the figure for the Pyeongchang 2018 Olympics was in fact 98% use of artificial snow, so almost 100%. And
Yeah.
if you look at Beijing, I think it will come out to be, if anything, about that number or even lower, because it has actually been snowing pretty heavily, on a lot of the particularly alpine courses recently. They've had to they've had to postpone events because it was snowing so heavily that the conditions just weren't conducive to competing. So probably by the end of the games you'll see a figure comparable to what we already saw in Pyeongchang. Certainly nothing exceptional. And this is sort of an existential issue for snow sports in general because of climate change. Certainly anyone living in the Western United States, which has been dealing with like perennial 1,000-year droughts in recent years, will know just how heavily like any ski resort has to depend on artificial snow to have a season that isn't dramatically curtailed. There's absolutely nothing exceptional about the particular way in which China has approached this for the Beijing Olympics.
Yeah.